Thank you for joining me today on the Private Investigator Experience podcast. I'm your host, Phil Little. On this channel, I talk about the life and cases of a PI, and I look at events nationally and globally that can affect our security and freedoms in our communities. I've watched our country go through wars, economic ups and downs, inflation, high interest rates. Yes, back years ago, at one point it was 12%, and numerous international events that have affected our country. One of the differences I see from growing up in the 40s, 50s, and onward is the indifference and lack of knowledge about our country's history and the lack of civic and community involvement, particularly our younger generation. It seems as if half the country is sleepwalking through their lives, as if someone else will handle all the threats that are coming on every side. Our enemies, starting after World War II, and by the time the Cold War was in full swing, the leaders of our enemies at that time were communists. And they soon decided the only way to defeat America was from within. Their long term plan was to recruit or get people in place that would work their way into government and education, start to tear down. We're seeing some results of that now. They were set for taking time, a long time if necessary, to build up the resistance to the American way. Secondly, they saw an opening that could give them a springboard to accelerate their results. That was our First Amendment rights and rule of law that allowed them to promote their cause, going right up to the line, but not crossing it with a call for violence. I'm just using my free speech, my free religion. I'm just promoting my religion. The threat that I'm looking at today used our freedom of religion, speech, and rule of law to help them promote what they were doing as a nonviolent religion or faith movement. Today, our threat isn't the communist as much as it is the threat of radical Islamic violence. And remember, they feel they have a right to lie and deceive non Muslims about their true intention. They can say, no, we're not violent. We don't have any plans of taking over the world and setting up a caliphate. We just want to let people know about what we believe. And if they want to follow us like Christianity or any other, they have a right to. Let me give you some facts about this situation. This is going to be a two-part series, and to keep it reader friendly, I'm going to break it down, and I will have the second part the following week. I do all my investigation through the lens of my military, law enforcement, intelligence service, and global security background. Then I add a bunch of my biblical worldview for solutions. With my over 50 years experience around the world, I believe the most dangerous threat we face is from radical Islam. First, let me be clear. This isn't about all Muslims or Arabs. I have many great Muslim friends, as I'm sure many of you do, who are nonviolent and freedom loving. But in every society or religion, we can see from the past there's radical violent elements. Even in the Christian religion, the Jewish and everything else, they're extremists in everyone. Today, though, we happen to be faced with this Islamic violence. And I'm going to give you some facts about this threat. There are several elements within the Islamic religion, and I think it's important that we as Americans understand the terms of what they mean. Let's start with this looking back to 2016. President Trump, in his first term, acknowledges the need for an ideological campaign against radical Islam. And even going back to President Obama, he stated that he was opposed to violent extremism and even organized an international summit around this subject. Yet, at times, Obama made it seem if he was more worried about Islamophobia than about radical Islam. In a speech to the United Nations General Assembly in 2012, Obama declared, the future must not belong to those who slander the Prophet of Islam. Well, there are two terms I want to look at here. Political Islam rather than radical Islam. Political Islam is not just a religion, as most Western citizens recognize the term religion or a faith. It is also a political ideology, a legal order, and in many ways, also a military doctrine associated with the campaigns of the Prophet Muhammad. Political Islam rejects any kind of distinction between religion, politics, mosque, and state. Now, pay attention to this. Lean in here. Political Islam even rejects a modern state in favor of a caliphate. The central argument is that political Islam implies a constitutional order fundamentally incompatible with the U.S. Constitution and with the Constitution of Liberty. That is the foundation of the American way of life. So, there can never be a coexistence, between an American constitutional way of life and an Islamic controlled society. They're two complete opposites. It is also true that political Islam, as an ideology, has its foundation in Islamic doctrine. Let's look at three terms: Islam, Islamism, and Muslims. They're distinctive concepts. Not all Muslims are Islamist or violent, but all are Islamist, including those who use violence. They are Muslim. Let me just restate that. Not all Muslims are Islamist, but all violent. But all the violent Islamists are Muslims. So it's all within the Muslim religion. And again, as with every religion, you can have violent and non-violent people. Some believe that Islam is capable of reformation, if only to distinguish it more clearly from the political ideology of Islamism. But that task of reform, now listen, can only be carried out by Muslims. And we can look back over the years and find that when moderate Muslims tried to rise up and speak against this violence and killing innocent people, they were quickly shut down and in many cases killed. But insisting that radical Islamist has nothing to do with Islam has led U.S. policymakers to commit numerous strategic errors since 9/11. One is to distinguish between a tiny group of extremists and an overwhelming majority of moderate Muslims. We need to look at the difference among these Muslim sects. There's two terms here I suspect you've never heard about. Most haven't. If in the West, I don't think really studied in depth, except maybe a few experts. But there's a term, Medina Muslims. They embrace the militant political ideology adopted by Muhammad in Medina. And then we have the Mecca Muslims, who prefer the religion originally promoted by Muhammad in Mecca. And then we have a third group, the reformers, who are open to some kind of Muslim reformation. These distinctions have their origins in history. The formative period of Islam can be divided roughly into two phases: the spiritual phase associated with Mecca, and the political phase that followed Muhammad's move to Medina. There's a substantial difference between the Quran's verses revealed in Mecca, largely spiritual in nature, and the Quran verses revealed in Mecca, more political and even militaristic. There's also a difference in the behavior of the Prophet Muhammad. In Mecca, he was a spiritual preacher, but in Medina, he became a political and military figure. It cannot be said often enough. The United States is not at war with Islam or with Muslims. But listen to this, my American friends. It is, however, bound to resist the political aspirations of the Medina Muslims, where those pose a direct threat to our civil and political liberties. We must stand up against those forces, no matter where they come from, who want to tear down our Constitution and our freedoms. It should also bound to ensure that the Mecca Muslims, the more moderate, And the reforming Muslims enjoy the same protection as members of other religious communities who accept the fundamental principles of a free society. That includes protection from the tactics of intimidation that are so central to the political ideology and the violent practices of political Islam. To give a little background on what some of the thoughts are from leaders in Islam and Muslims in that region, a letter some years ago from the Saudi grand head of the imams in Saudi Arabia, Ibn Baz, Ibnbaz. Now, I quote from his letter. The aim of dawah, and we'll look at that term a little later, and jihad is not to shed blood, make wealth, enslave women and children. Oh, those things sound great. We agree with that, right? Now listen, these things happen incidentally. Well, not the aim, of course. We don't will innocent people. This only takes place when the disbelievers, non-Muslims, refrain from accepting the truth and persist in disbelief and refuse to be subdued or slaves and pay the tax levied on free non-Muslims living in a Muslim rule, which is requested from them. I quote and go on. In this case, Allah has prescribed the Muslims to kill them, take their wealth as booty, and enslave their women and children. This religion, Islam, now listen to this, is superior to every law and system. The truth has been spread through the correct Islamic law, which in turn has been aided and supported by jihad whenever anyone stood in its way. It was jihad and dawah together which opened the doors to victories. That's from the head of the Muslim imams in Saudi Arabia years ago. Well, what's the background here? The conflict between the United States and political Islam in modern times dates back to at least 1979, where the U.S. embassy in Tehran was seized by Islamic revolutionaries and 52 Americans were held hostage for 444 days. In the decades that followed, 1993 World Trade Center bombing and the 1998 embassy bombing in Kenya and Tanzania reminded Americans of the threat posed by political Islam. And it was not until the 9/11 attacks that political Islam and as an ideology attracted sustained public attention. The September 11th, 2001 attacks were inspired by a political ideology that had its foundation in Islam, specifically its formative period in Medina. Since 9/11, close to $1 trillion has been spent on combat and reconstruction costs in Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. The total budgetary cost of wars and homeland security from 2001 through 2025 is approaching $4 trillion. Yet, in spite of these sacrifices, more than 5,000 armed service personnel have lost their lives since 9/11, and the tens of thousands of American soldiers who have been wounded. Today, political Islam is on the rise around the world. Look to Africa and the Christians that are being slaughtered today, now, by radical Islamists. We have seen the rise of Islamists in all forms of government positions and violence coming from those. Sometimes it's a lone wolf that's been encouraged. And then we have groups that have been radicalized by extremists. Violence is the most obvious, but not the only manifestation of this trend. Jihadist groups have grown all over the Middle East and North Africa, especially where states are weak and civil wars rage from Iraq, Libya, Somalia, Syria, not forgetting northern Nigeria. Islam-inspired terrorists have a global reach. France is in a permanent state of emergency. England's streets are filled with violence. While the United States has been profoundly shaken by terror attacks in Boston and Fort Hood, Texas, San Bernardino, California, Orlando, Florida, Ohio State University, and New Orleans, to name a few. Looking back at some of the worst years for terrorism was 2014, when 93 countries experienced attacks and 32,765 people killed. Then we have in 15, 29,376 killed. In recent years, four radical Islamic groups were responsible for 74% of deaths from terrorism: the Islamic State, ISIS, Boko Haram, the Taliban, and Al Qaeda. Although the Muslim world itself bears the heaviest burdens of jihadist violence, the West is increasingly under attack. Well, how large is the jihadist movement in the world? In Pakistan alone, where the population is almost entirely Muslim, 13% of Muslims surveyed, that's more than 20 million people, said that bombings and other forms of violence against civilian targets are often or sometimes justified in order to defend Islam from its enemies. Note some of the studies from Hamas and Gaza since the attacks there in Israel in 2023, where many regular Muslims supported the brutal attack on Israel. Disturbingly, the number of Western-born Muslim jihadists is sharply increasing. The United States shares that tens of thousands of fighters from at least 80 nations have traveled to Syria to join the radical jihadists. Roughly a quarter of them came from Western Europe. But the advance of political Islam manifests itself not only in acts of violence, even as billions are spent on military intervention, drone strikes. The ideological infrastructure of political Islam in the United States continues to grow because officials are only concerned with criminal conspiracies to commit acts of violence. Listen, not with the ideology that inspires such acts. When you take out the heads or even the top people in a violent organization, there's others that rise up. That's not the problem. It's the same thing with cartels. You can take out the heads of cartels, but new heads spring up and they keep going. You have to go to its foundation. According to one estimate, 10 to 15% of the world's Muslims are Islamist or violent. Out of well over 1.6 billion, or 23% of the globe's population, that implies more than 160 million individuals. This is not a small problem. Based on survey data on attitudes toward Sharia law in Muslim countries, total support for Islamic activities in the world is likely significantly higher than that estimate. As I wind down this first section of this, I want to look at this review with two things here. Scholarship on political Islam. There are two sets of academic literature aimed at helping policymakers grapple with the threat of radical Islam. In the first set, Islamic religion ideas argues that a combination of variables such as poverty and corrupt political governance lies at the root of Islamic violence. In other words, just be nice to them, treat them well, and everybody will be less violent and be better. They urge the U.S. government and its allies to tackle these root causes. For those authors, devoting attention to religious motive is at its best minor, they say, and worse, a harmful distraction. They're not concerned about political Islam as an ideology, only about individual acts of violence committed in its name. That thought has led us to the threat we see today. The second set of scholars, which is growing in importance, sees a radical ideology derived from Islamic theology, principles, and concepts as the driving force of our current predicament. Scholars acknowledge that poverty and other things, bad governments are there, but argue that the U.S. policymakers should take seriously the religious ideology and underlying Islamic violence. Well, we've had failed policies in many ways since 9/11. I'd like your thoughts, comments, what you think, what you would like to hear about. Read them on any of the platforms, or you can email me at plittlepi777@gmail.com. And would you help me by liking, sharing, subscribing? And you know the drill. Hit that notification bell for future posts. Let your voice be heard. Stand up out of the crowd. Get involved. Most of these things, you can find out so much on the internet if you got involved. We need to take this threat seriously because the very existence of our way of life is at stake. Now, if you happen to have a situation in your family or business that you wonder, could a private investigator help me? Send me that in a summary to p777 at gmail.com. And I'll let you know if a private investigator can help. Well, until next time, be safe. I'll fill you in on the rest of this Islamic violent threat. And may God bless you, your family, and may God bless America. See you next time.